So thank you very much, everybody, for inviting me to come and talk about this particular topic. As Tricia said, I've been very involved in it for some years now. And I've been watching with interest what's been happening with the various wilding schemes. Anyway, enough of that for the moment. You'll see I call myself an ancient treeologist. There isn't a term for me really, because ancient trees make you look at things in all sorts of different ways, through tree archaeology, history, ecology. I mean, actually, ecology is just deep history, because things take a long, long time to evolve. They make us look at trees through climate change, ecosystem services, and also a beauty perspective. So there's not quite any particular term. People sometimes call us tree ecologists, but that's far too narrow a term. Anyway, I've been an ancient treeologist for about 30 years now. So that's what my driving force in terms of rewilding. These mega structures, not only are they mega in terms of size, they are mega in terms of age, and any wilding scheme has to take them into consideration. Now, that Martin is not moving. So, sorry. So just to put us into perspective, the UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. Actually, I would slightly debate that in terms of our population of ancient and other veteran trees. I think we are one of the best in Europe, if not the top in Europe, particularly for some species anyway. So they haven't actually looked at old growth, or they're not measuring old growth, but in many ways the UK, and I hope to just say a few words about that, is a top area in the world for old growth. The government has made a 30 by 30 pledge, which commits us to protect 30% of our land and marine area within the decade. But it's a Weasley word, protect, and we could look at that in some detail. But basically, what does protect mean in terms of securing the future of the species and the landscape history within those protected areas? Is that enough? And really it isn't. But at this stage now, we have such crises that we've got to really do both at the same time. I'm very, very reluctant to just go down the climate crisis route, because fundamentally, I think nature can help us totally out of the mess that we're in. We're the ones that have put nature in a mess. Nature, I think, has got the answers. So I'll talk a bit about that. First of all, though, rewilding. And for me, it's always got to have the large herbivores. Now, I'm sorry about that if, in terms of a garden, because it's quite difficult to have large herbivores. You could have rabbits in your garden, and they would count as large herbivores. I was just talking about this the other day. So maybe you can put some rabbit hutches out on the lawn and involve them in rewilding your garden. But for me, it's really the large herbivores that are the greatest priority in the process. A lot of people talk about the carnivores, and of course that would be the icing on the cake, but there are very, very great hurdles for us as an isolated island in terms of bringing in carnivores. We have to celebrate the ones that we've got, the foxes, the stoats, the weasels, the white-tailed eagles, the golden eagles, all of those. We've got to celebrate those and maximize their capacity to act as large carnivores. But and also watch what's happening in Europe, because it's quite fascinating how wolves have made it into the Netherlands, and they're starting to have a big debate about what happens to the wolves in the Netherlands. Just to say, though, that when I'm talking about rewilding, I'm not talking about abandonment. There is great concern across the whole of Europe about the loss of people working in many parts of Europe as traditional farmers, and the impact that that's having on biodiversity. And we will say a bit more about that. So what I'm talking about in terms of large herbivores, and again, I'm afraid we have already made some of the significant players extinct. So we no longer have the wild cattle, although 2 attempts have been made to breed back a species that will act as wild cattle. So that was the Heck cattle by the German brothers in the Heck brothers in Germany. They have a reputation for being very aggressive, so people are quite concerned about them, although they have been used in Oostvaardersplassen. And now there is a new kid on the block, which is called Taurus, and the Dutch are promoting that in parts of the Netherlands and in some of the rewilding projects in Central Europe. So that's very, very interesting to watch, whether they bring back the natural processes with them, how we can rewild them. We no longer have the wild horse either. They were pushed out, but perhaps our Exmoor pony is the closest thing in terms of DNA to the wild horse. So we're lucky in this country that we've got Exmoor ponies, and we can work with those as a very, very close analogue to that particular species. We also have red deer, and there is such a debate about red deer and deer in general. They are very much disliked by many sectors of the working landscape. But I was delighted to hear recently that the MOD had introduced them to the Heathland Ranges in Surrey, and were celebrating the fact that they were improving biodiversity there. They are an enormous benefit to us because they are not treated as a domesticated animal, and therefore don't need to be looked at every day and don't need to be tagged. So we underestimate the value of our native deer enormously, and should really be reconsidering that. Wild boar are in the country. There's a lot of talk about whether they're feral wild boar, in which case they can replicate at a very great rate. But in many of the wilding projects, we're using, again, an analogue, which is the Tamworth pig, or even the Gloucester spot. I can't remember what the title of it is offhand. We're using other pigs as alternatives. And obviously, we have had 1,000 years probably of fallow deer in the landscape. Now, again, the jury is a bit out on that in terms of ecological perspectives. They are a herding animal, and if they do escape, they have got, again, a reputation of causing quite an impact in the landscape. But they are used in rewilding projects, and of course they are part of many of our deer parks. And I certainly would be encouraging the development of re-establishment, restoration of medieval deer parks, to actually learn a lot more about how deer operate in those particular areas. So these are the main drivers. But can I just say, please, not sheep or goats. They are not analogues of native animals. And they've been used for many, many decades as a conservation tool, but we have to be very careful of their limitations And it's not just about their selectivity in terms of choice of what they eat. There's other aspects that are have very serious consequences. So I'm not at all supportive of sheep or goats, and I believe these other herbivores can provide just as good an alternative, if not better, to sheep, even in relatively small areas. So the whole idea of these large herbivores came from the Dutch in the first place. The guys who were involved in re-establishing Taurus, they were thinking about this way back in the 1980s. And then we get the rise of places like Oostvaardersplassen. And it has been an utterly remarkable experiment. Unfortunately, it has gone awry in these last few years, and what was an incredibly valuable project has actually lost the key features that are so important. So if we just look at a graph which might show management intensity. Now I should be able to do I'm not quite sure how I do a marker, but anyway, let's look up the left-hand arm, management intensity, and then we look along the bottom, and that's a log curve in terms of area. Then obviously we all know that Yellowstone and Okavango, they're huge in size, and they have the most minimum of management intensity, and that's really what we're always striving for, is large landscape scale, so that we have to do as little as possible to actually manage that landscape and let natural processes work as much as possible. At the other end of the scale, up at the top left, up at the high, that's actually where most of our SSSIs are, and our little nature reserves. So they're not only small in size, but actually we are, generally speaking, managing them incredibly intensively. And that is hard work, but also, I would argue, is trying to hold the SSSI or the nature reserve in a particular place, a particular habitat. Is trying to hold it in one state. And I'm afraid that just isn't going to work for a very long period of time, because we will have catastrophic effects, which actually can't be coped with. They're not resilient enough to cope with the sorts of vagaries of the climate and other factors, pests and diseases, etc. So we must strive to buffer and extend those as much as we can, and buffer them and extend them to such an extent that they start to join up. I wouldn't advocate that we stop managing them, but outside those key areas, we've got to do rewilding so that the species can jump out and act in a more natural way. Once we have got the system right, we can then bring down the fences around the nature reserve and let the whole thing start moving around the landscape. Our best example to date is, of course, Knepp, which is really somewhere, well, it's not quite in the middle because this is a log scale, but is looking like it's in the middle in terms of this. It's a large project, and I want to say quite a bit about that in terms of what we've learned from the Rewilding project. As I said earlier, I'm really looking at this from the ancient tree perspective, and we know that ancient trees are not found in closed canopy systems. So don't bother to go looking for ancient trees in classic, what I might call classic woodland or forestry forests, plantation forests, because unless they're on the boundaries, they're not really there unless really. So don't go looking for them. They are ancient trees. As they age, go past full height and their crowns change after they've gone past maturity, they are generally speaking shrinking in size. And if they were surrounded by competition, those trees would be very quickly suffocated by the light. It's a light exclusion would stop them from surviving. We also know that the species that are associated with them value very much the open structure, the light reaching the tree in all sorts of 360 degrees. And they particularly, we have specialist species on those massive lower horizontal limbs, which catch the light in a very special way. The species that are associated with these trees, generally speaking, get better and better the older the tree. When I mean better and better, they start around about the time of maturity. That's when the hollowing process starts, and they can, generally speaking, they are not able to exist on younger trees. So this tells us, and there's not just one or two, we're not talking about one or two, and we're not talking about just a few insects, we're talking about lichens, we're talking about fungi, we're talking about insects. And don't forget that in the process of hollowing, etc., they're providing habitat for all sorts of other important charismatic species like birds and bats, amphibians, all sorts of other things as well. So what we do know then, so put those two things together, ancient trees can't be surrounded by competition, and the specialist species tell us that. So how does the tree remain in the open, like this particular Scots pine up at Mar Lodge? It's the largest by girth in Scotland. How might not be the oldest, but it's one of the oldest. How did that live all its long life in the open? And the answer to that is grazing. So for me, grazing is synonymous with old growth habitat. And we won't have old growth habitat if we don't have these wilder systems with these large mega herbivores. If we're just looking at this, I mean, Scots pine is one of our most light demanding species. I mean, it's got very, very low tolerance to shade. And that means that, you know, it really doesn't like anything touching its canopy or restricting its canopy. It's also allowing light through, so things can come up underneath it. And that's one of the big dangers, is that almost the amount of shade the tree is tolerant to is also the amount of light that it lets through. So if it's a very shade tolerant tree, it lets very little light through. So right at the bottom of the scale, you've got beech and yew, and all of you will know when you visited beech plantations, ancient yew sites, you'll know that there's very little growing on the ground at all. Very little lower canopy. And what I would also say is that, you know, what we need is habitats that can actually have enough room to wander across the landscape, so that we can have young trees as well as these old trees. There's no doubt we've got to have the young ones coming along, but we've got to be very careful how we actually do that. I mentioned this in terms of biodiversity. These old trees are really what we're talking about in terms of old growth. And really, the ecologists in this country have been incredibly slow to recognize this. Bearing in mind that in 1986, Francis Rose and Paul Harding brought out their book, which talked about pasture woodlands. And they said that these old trees in these collections of old trees are old growth. And they said we had an international responsibility to this, because they are the nearest, they are indicators, they are keystone species of the most wild landscapes. So that's what they said in their book in '86. Instead, I'm afraid we went down the route of ancient woodland, and ancient woodland classically has been an intensive form of wood production over centuries. And because of that intensity of wood production, there are, generally speaking, no ancient trees within those sites. And therefore, ancient woodlands, and many of them have been converted now to young plantations, even if they're native trees, are being converted to young plantations. And I'm afraid in terms of tree biodiversity, they are extremely wanting. They would have been in some ways part of a small part of the wider landscape. And I want to explain how that happens in a few slides. But what are we talking here? And I'm not just talking about the above ground structures, because we have to remember the mycorrhizal fungi that are associated with these plants. And they too, we have the best mycorrhizal species where we have concentrations of these ancient trees. For example, Windsor Great Park is tops, New Forest is next in line. They are incredibly important for invertebrates. The invertebrates can't actually, on the whole, take advantage of the wood within the tree until the fungi have done their work. And it's really the decay fungi that are they are mega keystone species of the old growth system. And they too have an incredible part to play in these old landscapes. And of course, the bark, as the tree ages, changes, becomes very craggy on occasions, pH can change. And generally speaking, that's where we find some of the superb lichens that are the best lichens. And they're still being found in some of our ancient tree sites today. Astonishing, isn't it? That, Neil Sanderson went into Windsor recently and found a new species, and somebody went to Chatsworth recently and found new species, new to Britain. It astonishes me that we ecologists are not actually waking up to that in a much more urgent way, because we should not be complacent about this. So where are these fabulous old growth sites? And I've given you some places already. No surprise that they're in places which were the old medieval hunting grounds, dating way back before the Normans. But red deer are a keystone feature. Don't forget, red deer are the only wild herbivore, really, that has survived down the millennia that were painted in the cave paintings. As I said, the aurochs gone extinct, the wild horses have gone extinct, but the deer actually managed to stay wild and are still wild. And again, just because of that, I think they should be really thought about very carefully in terms of they are biodiversity, and we should be thinking about that first and foremost, and thinking about what we're doing that is making them appear as a pest, if we can put it that way. So the key ones, of course, we've got Sherwood there, Skerwudu, Sherwood. We've got Selwood. We've got the New Forest and the Forest of Bere down around the Solent. We've got the Forest of Essex, and Knepp, for example, is right at the end of this Anderedesveld, which actually was considered a royal hunting forest even in Roman times. But look at the description, 15th century description, wild, jumps out at you. These are wild, these were the wildest places which were protected by the elite. And the reasons the oaks were very, very valued in these landscapes is because they provided fabulous acorns, because the deer were incredibly precious to the elite as their wild beasts to chase. But they were very much valued by the elite as beautiful places, and hence, after a bit, instead of just riding out to hunt, and stopping at royal hunting lodges if they were caught out overnight, they then said to their people, please build me a stately home in these landscapes because they're so beautiful. And that's why in Pride and Prejudice, you know, we sweep down the carriage route down into the parkland and across to the big house. And it all comes back to the fact that we really, really value these parkland landscapes, and they are incredibly special. So let's just digress a bit as to what am I saying with these royal hunting forests? Well, how does it all work? Well, Franz Vera, who is one of the leading protagonists of this is his theory or his hypothesis, did a lot of work in a place called Borkner Paradise in Germany. And here you have the two of the main players in this landscape. So on the left-hand side, you've got the blackthorn, which you can quite easily see because right-hand side, sorry, you've got blackthorn, and in the middle, you've got hawthorn. And the two work different ways. And if I do hawthorn first of all, the hawthorn, because it doesn't sucker effectively, is kept tight by the grazing animals. That's the source of the open grown tree, particularly the oak. And in the sloe or the blackthorn, that's where you get the oak seeding into the edge of the blackthorn. It suckers out, so you get another ring of oaks when they're grown up and produce seed, and then they grow up and produce seed. So you're getting waves and rings and rings and rings, creating what we would call a grove of trees. But they sort of have a finite size, whereas most foresters would say we want the regeneration in the grove of trees. Actually, no, that's not how the system works, I'm afraid. After a bit, animals get through the blackthorn, they get into the grove of trees, they're browsing in there, no regeneration happens. But in the middle of the grove, the oldest tree dies. Then you get a donut. That donut inside, that hollow inside, that empty space inside is widening and widening. You get back to grass or pasture, I should say, wildflower rich pasture. I want to say a lot about that. And then the whole process starts again. Your hawthorn or your sloe gets established. So that's what I mean by a dynamic, moving mosaic of habitat across the landscape. And one of the key players in all of this is the jay, but there are other birds that are vectors. But the jay will plant its seedling or its acorn right on the edge of this scrub. It's the one that's doing the work of the planting. And then because these oaks need a little bit of protection in their early stages from grazing, that scrub gives them just enough protection, but it doesn't exclude the light. So they can get established, they're protected by the thorn, and then once they get through that thorn, they can burst through and then either become an individual open grown tree to become an ancient of the future, or they go into a grove and operate as I've been explaining. This system gives us the opportunity to have every species of tree present, every species of scrub present. It allows us to have open wildflower pasture. So in fact, it is the ultimate habitat in its own right and provides us with all those lovely species that we love about the British countryside. What's not to like about it? You know, why do we fail to recognize how important this sort of habitat is in our landscape? And actually, on the whole, we're doing mostly not the right thing in those particular habitats that we have. And this is also supported, the process of generation of the old trees is captured in old sayings. These old sayings written down for the first time in the 1600s. People knew that the thorn is the mother of the oak, but in France they call the bramble the cradle of the oak. And if you go to Transylvania and to the massive wood pastures that they've got, you can see this dynamic system operating there very, very easily, and in parts of Spain where they have huge landscapes with regeneration and in these wonderful grazed landscapes. So this is why we were interested in Knepp, and we have to say a few things about Knepp Estate. It's just outside Horsham in West Sussex. This is the A24 going down the right-hand side of the map there. It was in Andredesvald. It was a medieval deer park, a Knepp deer park, and King John actually went hunting there. And for various reasons, it's Charlie Burrell's grandparents kept many of the big old oak trees in the landscape rather than clearing them out. And that gives us a lot of insights into the history of this landscape, particularly their associated wildlife. It's a big site, 3,500 acres. The main wilding area is what we call the southern block, in the pale green. Up the right, there's the middle block with the great big lake in it, and then the northern block to the top. Those have different proportions of graze and different proportions of grazing animals in them, the types of herbivores in them. To the left there, around the village of Shipley, that's being turned into what's called a regenerative farm. And the idea behind that is to see how well the regenerative farming can match the impact of the rewilded area. But the story is, of course, many of you will have read the book. Charlie came out of agricultural college as a young man, and he believed his grandparents weren't farming efficiently enough, weren't farming effectively enough. So he spent 20 years intensifying production at Knepp to try and prove that you could do it with modern equipment, with modern chemicals. You could make a really good going concern out of Knepp. And it ended up with this absolute, almost wall-to-wall monocultures of cereals, but he made a profit on about 2 years out of the 20. And just so happened he was having a big reflection on what he was doing. He hated the arable crops coming right up to his back door. He loathed it, and he knew that biodiversity was going downhill. And he really, so a lot of things happened at the same sort of time. And that's when Ted Green met him, and very soon after that I met him, and we knew Frans Vera, and we knew about Osvaldus Blassen and other rewilding projects in the Netherlands like Millingevaart, and met the wonderful Willem Overmars. And we took him and his trustees to see those sites. And on the way back, I said to Charlie when we were traveling back, Charlie, so what do you make of that? And he said, it's been the most life-changing experience that I've had, when he was in his mid-40s. And he came back and he started the Rewilding project. And basically introduced large grazing herbivores, took out the fencing, and sat back and watched what was happening. As you can see, there's a lot of great structure there already, in terms of the great big open parkland trees. But and in places, it feels just like it could feel on the Serengeti. It is incredible. And obviously, as he did this project, he didn't treat all the fields the same, particularly in the southern block. A lot of fields came out of agriculture before they introduced the large grazing herbivores. So each field is different depending on how that process happened. And in some cases, there was a massive regeneration of scrub, which worries me, and I'll say a few words about that. But this is, again, where natural processes astound us, because what happened was in various parts of Knepp, there was a massive regeneration of sallow. Now, I have never, ever come across a woodland creation scheme that has planted sallow on a massive scale to such an extent as Knepp. And it was a game changer, because Matthew Oates, who worked for the National Trust, was their expert in terms of butterflies. He thought he knew the life story of the Purple Emperor. I'm going to come back to that later. But what he hadn't realized was the part that sallow plays in the life cycle of the butterfly. And then Knepp became the top site almost within 10 years for the Purple Emperor, which is a very spectacular butterfly. So our ecology, that's what natural processes are about, is about letting nature do something, and then it will astound us. And that's what's happened at Knepp. It has astounded us on so many fronts. So immediately the hedges started to fatten up, you know, you get this cross section, hollow in the middle, with and shade, stopping regeneration in the middle, stopping much, so the birds can come down in the middle to the ground and feed safely. But it's growing out and providing still this tremendous cover. And again, the nightingale came back in great numbers. So it's not only come back to Knepp, but it's almost so abundant that they're expanding out into the wider countryside. So they're finding ringed nightingales from Knepp now over as far as Gatwick and further north in Sussex. So it's so good that it's providing this wider landscape recovery. And I mean, 28 singing males in 2020, it is a fantastic place to visit at the end of April, beginning of May, when they're in full throttle. So sallow was the great surprise. I've told that story, but it's become a fantastic hotspot for all sorts of species. We'll talk a little bit about the turtle dove, the cuckoo as well. You know, I live in a very, very important river valley in East Devon, and I'm lucky if I hear one cuckoo in the year, and it doesn't stay. Children do not hear the cuckoo these days, but if you want to hear the cuckoo, you go to Knepp to hear it. It's astonishing, isn't it? That what they're doing there is turning the tables. What are they doing there that is so fantastic for wildlife? And all sorts of other species are benefiting from this. So the Purple Emperor, absolutely beautiful, beautiful butterfly. So here's the population monitoring. So, you know, in 2015, they were already aware that it was a really important site. Dropped a bit the next year, started building again. 2018, an enormous number of Purple Emperors on this monitoring transit. So in 2019, we thought, my goodness, it's going to be an absolute wow. But I'm afraid 2 weeks of the year when the Purple Emperor is at its peak were extremely bad weather for the Purple Emperor, and its population has gone down. So this is what I mean by we have to have resilient landscapes. We cannot rely on small habitats, small pockets, and because there are all sorts of forces out there that are working against them. 2020, a very low number. and we wait to see what the population will be like this year. What will it bring? Will the weather be good for it so that it carries on thriving in a landscape that it likes? The other thing, of course, is, has the sallow gone beyond the stage when it provides a fabulous habitat for the purple emperor? And that's another factor that we have to bear in mind, that might just be a pulse. And we certainly wouldn't start coppicing at Knepp to maintain the numbers, but how do we manage the sallow, or what is the natural process of the sallow for us to make sure that there are in this landscape plenty of the sallows in the right condition for the purple emperor? Lots to learn yet, so much to learn. Lots of lovely butterflies at Knepp. Really, you know, I think what they say is there's only 62 species ever in Sussex. Actually, I can increase that to 63. 52 were found during the atlas when they were doing the recent butterfly atlas, and 36 species at Knepp. But the latest news is the excitement about the large tortoiseshell, because last year they found first breeding records at Knepp. That they were found actually breeding at Knepp. They'd had one record the previous year at the large tortoiseshell, but they actually found them breeding last year on wych elm. So this is astonishing. Now, you know, you could be cynical and think that that might be a release, and it certainly hasn't been released by people at Knepp, not at all. So, you know, or consciously by the staff or the system there, unless somebody's wandered in with a pot and released them. But it's also very interesting that they're on wych elm, and what that will mean in the future, I don't know. The turtle dove, again, unbelievably under threat, but at Knepp, the figures are going up. And there's just that lovely purring sound, I hope you can hear that, of the turtle dove. And they had 20 singing males in 2020, and I think that's certainly holding up. We're yet to find out what the 2023 figures are, because they haven't really done a survey of them. But the big story with the turtle doves is the pigs, because the pigs rootle, they create this habitat. This is then good for the flowers that produce these small seeds, and this is what the turtle dove is feeding on when it comes back in the summer. And yesterday I was at Knepp. I was looking at an area that pigs had worked over, and there were the scarlet pimpernel there ready for the turtle doves. Cuckoos have been fantastic, as I say, and they are doing a lot of monitoring at Knepp. So this is why we also know why Knepp is so fantastic, because so much monitoring is now going on that we're being able to record how successful it is. But I don't know of other sites in the country that are doing as well as this. So it's to do with no herbicides, it's to do with no fertilizers, it's to do with free-ranging animals, it's to do with the scrub, it's to do with allowing the land to become fallow and the soil to recover. And soil is another thing that I want to talk about. So lots of other figures, you know, lots of other species. You know, it's not just about the ones that I've talked about, which are the headline species, but you know, it's a really, really thriving site for biodiversity. I can say that Knepp is exceptional in terms of biodiversity. So I know rewilding works for biodiversity based on Knepp, because why should just an ordinary intensively farmed farm suddenly become so good for species if it wasn't the rewilding process? It's not happening in other places. And it's not just in terms of breeding success. All of these species on the left-hand side are migrants, and they're flying over Knepp and spotting it as they fly over on migration and coming down for a quick snack. So, you know, it's really, look at that, 623 black caps. They're not breeding on that site, they're coming in as they migrate. So it's a very, very valuable stopover place for warblers. But the great news now is that Knepp is not on its own, and this is what's happening now. There's a big push to link Knepp up with wider landscape, particularly along the river. So this is the Wheel to Waves project. Starts at the top in Ashdown Forest, linkage all the way there along the St Leonard's Forest down to Knepp, then via the RSPB reserves, and either down through the Adur or down through the Arun, down to the sea. And it doesn't stop there. It's all about reinstating the kelp beds as well. And kelp is one of the best species for carbon sequestration and storage. So again, this is all helping to generate fantastic benefits, not just for wildlife, but for climate change as well, or carbon sequestration as well. For climate change, let's think about that for a minute. And I've just illustrated 4 out of at least 42 problems that we're going to get with climate change. So the first one is an image taken in France after the 1999 hurricane went through near Fontainebleau, or that is Fontainebleau, and absolutely devastated the this was an oak seed stand in Fontainebleau, the pride of the French, and absolutely ripped it apart. And it doesn't, we hear it all the time with these big winds that our forestry plantations are falling over like 9 pins. And we've got to change our practices. I was hearing foresters just the other day saying, we've got to change. We've just got to change. We can't have monocultures anymore. It's just not going to be resilient enough. And here again is a tree onto the right of it, which is an open grown tree, survived the storm, but very interestingly here, you can see on the left-hand side where it broke its branches, those branches have regenerated in a very strong way. You can see that growth, and if you cut one of those branches off, it would date back to the 87 gale. On the right-hand side, as we look at it of the tree, probably what's happened there is that the tree has actually rocked, and possibly because it's that side is on the side of the prevailing winds, might have broken its roots, and therefore it's actually suffering quite badly from not recovering from the storm in quite the same way as the other side is, where the roots probably weren't broken. So we're learning a lot about the impacts of climate change and particularly wind through looking at these open grown trees. But the great story there was that after the 87 gale, Francis Rose was sent out by Natural England to look at the ancient trees with the lichens on it. And he went out with a very, very heavy heart, but came back unbelievably relieved, because the open grown trees in general had survived the storm very easily. They might have dropped the odd branch, but they were still very much alive and standing and kicking. It was the forestry plantations that fell over, and not so much the trees outside woods, except if those trees outside woods had very, very bad root damage through cultivation, farming practices, etc. But this picture at bottom left is taken by Ted Green in France in the Great Heat. And I was with arborists the other day saying that they were from Bologna in Italy. Last year they had quite a long period of 40 degrees C, and it killed trees dead. So we are not far off 40 degrees for a protracted enough period in summer to kill trees. We have a very, very serious situation on our hands. And I don't believe we have the solutions to that, because I don't believe it's just as easy as bringing in trees from 2 degrees south. And I don't believe we know enough about how other trees can cope in these changing circumstances to trust bringing them in to plant them. I would still go with our native species, and I'll say a bit more about that. But we're not just going to face climate change. We've all heard the warnings today about the thunderstorms and huge deluges coming through, and the impact that has in terms of our river systems, etc. And how can we do something to hold back the flow, slow the flow, before it becomes flooding like we have in the right-hand picture, and the impact of that, particularly in towns, etc. That's just 4 out of the 42 different types of conditions that our landscapes might face. Late frosts, drought, you know, it's just a huge number. And perhaps I think, as in the bottom left-hand corner, lack of water for trees to transpire in the summer is going to be an incredibly major factor, because trees really must transpire. In America, I think there are species that can actually close down the transpiration process in the height of the day in the summer. But trees do need to transpire to survive, really. I think it's extremely worrying if there's not good moisture conditions in the soil. And I think also Peter Wohlleben has written recently in his new book, you know, Trees Can Save the World, yes, but he too is advocating using native, local as much as possible in that book. So we have really to address intensive agriculture and intensive forestry. It's my view that, as you can see, they cover a huge amount of the British landscape. And I think that both agriculture and forestry have led to the crisis in biodiversity, and are adding to the problems in terms of climate change, because they cover so much of the land surface. If we can do something about those areas, then we will have we will make a big difference. So on the left-hand picture, this is the Axe Valley, and they are trying hard to do restoration on the Axe Valley. I'm afraid it is in a very serious state. They are trying their best, but I'm afraid the DEFRA advisors who are going in to see farmers in the Axe Valley are telling them to intensify further. That's what they're advising farmers to do. And really, that's not going to help us at all. That's just going to make matters worse. What they're doing is putting animals into barns, and then bringing a growing maize, which is a major source of food for the cattle, which they feed inside the barns. And that means that there's enormous amounts of soil runoff if there's a deluge. You know, soil is not being safeguarded at all, and damages root systems. And that sort of depth of cultivation for maize is releasing carbon into the atmosphere. So it's just very, very serious. They're both very, very serious. And, you know, this is forestry practices. Not only is this practice very bad for the soil in terms of the forest, but, you know, those wet tracks are an absolute channel for diseases like phytophthora to move along. We know this. We should be doing something about it. And planting, I'm afraid I think we're far too late. It's just a waste. It's not a waste of time to do planting. But the trees we put in the ground today, these size trees, are not really going to sequester sufficient carbon or start sequestering sufficient carbon until till they're about 30 years old. It's too late. If you've seen the information that's coming out about the sea temperature rises, and the ice melting in Antarctica and in the Arctic, and the glaciers going, I mean, and the carbon dioxide is still going up in the atmosphere. Trees are absolutely not the solution at all. And I don't think they're the solution for biodiversity either. I really don't. So here's some work done by Rob Fuller. And this was a woodland, this is on woodland creation sites. And basically, yes, you get a blip of good birds. Rob Fuller works for the BTO, and he's been their lead researcher for decades. Yeah, you do get a blip of birds, first of all. That's because the grass grows long, and that gives cover for voles, and you get a lot of birds coming in because the pressure, it's not arable. That's the thing, it's not an arable crop. But that once you get canopy closure, as you can see in the second bit, you get a closed canopy, that shading impact, then the bird populations drop dramatically. And at 70 years, you are harvesting and starting the process again if you're going into a forestry system. Now, if you're not doing it for forestry and you're doing it for conservation interest, yes, you can intervene, but how are you going to intervene? What are the best interventions that you can do to make this into an open, to give the benefits for the birds? Well, that's opening it up, basically. Well, why not start with a wood pasture to start with, which we know the Knepp system is good. I've not heard one record from one major tree planting scheme that is of any good for biodiversity. Once the canopy closes, they're hopeless. So that's for birds. They're designed to exclude plants, as in the shade bit, and therefore they're designed to exclude butterflies, absolutely everything. So I just am totally unconvinced about the tree planting argument, I'm afraid. And I actually think, personally, we shouldn't be trying to sell this to children. It's the wrong messages that we're trying to sell. And I think we have got to think very hard about what we do. I was out with the river, the anglers on the River Axe recently, and they were saying, oh, we're talking to the children about the river, and we're taking them out doing river fly monitoring and showing them how to do it onto a river that's in a desperately bad state. And I really don't think that's the right thing that we should be doing, frankly. We've got to restore the rivers, give them back what is the right river. Anyway, agroforestry and regenerative agriculture may help us with some climate issues. And of course, it's a much better approach than intensive agriculture, and can give us wood products at the same time. But I'm not convinced about it being significant for biodiversity, because these are still landscapes that are producing goods, and there's ever a drive to get more and more productivity out of them, and they're short-term habitats. So I'm not convinced about that either. I said a bit about trees for the future. This happens to be in Australia after a period of 5 or 6 years of massive drought in Canberra, or just outside Canberra. And these are English elms and English oaks, and they're doing extremely well in that landscape. So, we have in this country been importing trees from all over the world for hundreds of years, and we have records of those. I'm a trustee of the Tree Register of the British Isles, and I know many of those trees are doing exceptionally well. But the point there is they're not under stress from being driven to be productive trees. They are given space, they're given time, they're given lots of light, their roots aren't compromised. They're growing in the very best conditions. And we can look at those trees and see which ones are going to do best as the years change and the climate changes. So we do have sources of information about trees that we might go back to and look at. And I think that tree register database is exceptionally important because of that. We know where those trees came from. We usually have records of the seed and where the seed came from. So that, I think, is a really useful database, but as far as I know, nobody is looking at it. The key thing is we've got to let trees regenerate where they think it's best to regenerate. We also, so that's really important. And what we do know, and I got this last night from one of the leading Dutch rewilders, is that 30% of the world's carbon is stored in savanna wood pasture landscapes. So they are massively important. And they capture and hold 50% more carbon than forests, than closed canopy forests. So that's what he's promoting. And I know that there's been a little bit of research done on wood pastures. And as far as I know, that little research has indicated exactly the same story. They are the very best for capturing carbon, but are very best for capturing carbon, but are also extremely valuable for biodiversity. So let's look at this in terms of Knepp. What do we know from Knepp? Well, unfortunately, we still haven't really caught up with this whole business of capturing carbon. I don't really know. We don't really have a lot of information, but they have sent in the people to record what's been happening at Knepp, and they've compared it with arable land in the surrounding area. And what they've shown is over the period of 10 years, they've doubled the soil organic carbon. And with that, they've doubled the organisms within it, and including the fungi. So to me, that demonstrates that wilding is good for biodiversity, but it's also very, very good for carbon capture and storage, and that's going into the soil. Now, I want to talk about what we can do, and I'm really keen on wildflowers. And I'm really keen on what's below ground with wildflowers. And this is a lovely little diagram from the Floodplain Meadow Partnership. Look at all that different root structure. And that's what we need. We need the diversity in the soil, and we need the deep rooters, because what the health of the soils is all driven by the rooting of the plants. That's where the sugars are coming down from above and going into the micro organisms. And that's where all the recycling is going on. That's where the nutrients are being recycled. Very close, well, quite close to the roots, but not absolutely close to the roots. Take a look at perennial ryegrass. Grass is a nightmare for soil because it's very short, or it doesn't grow very deep, it's very bushy. And if you have a monoculture of ryegrass, you are basically damaging your soil because nothing is getting past those roots to go down into the deeper soil. So perennial ryegrass, I think, is actually damaging our soils enormously. And that's what 40% of our farms are in terms of our pasture. They are perennial ryegrass. They haven't got a single bit of diversity in them. So we've got to get more variety back in. And that's really what regenerative agriculture is putting one or two species like sainfoin back into the mixes to try and get that deeper structure. But look at these, knapweed, one of the deepest, birdsfoot trefoil, another very deep one, great burnet. These, if you've got those species in your wildflower meadow, and the point is we can restore them quite quickly. And these, if we can get them going, are working straight away. And if we can get them on scale, at a scale, then we are going to sequester carbon in a much, much greater way. And we can have grazing, and we can have biodiversity with it. So please think about putting wildflowers into any patch of grass that exists in your area, on road verges, in parks, in your grass, in your lawns. You know, come on, let's diversify with wildflowers, and then we know it'll be good for the insects. We know then it'll be good for the web of life. I'm really keen on that. Plus, of course, the odd tree as well to grow in there, because they too will help. But the other thing I haven't said is, of course, ryegrass, the grasses are not mycorrhizal. All these other plants are mycorrhizal. So what you're seeing here is only a small part of the influence that they're having across that soil horizon. So plants are far more important, really, than I won't say about grasses, because grasses, some of these grasses are very, you know, are obviously playing a part in this system, but grasses don't have the mycorrhizal links at all with them. So the plants are exceptionally important. And when Ted Green and I went to Romania, we were looking at the wildflower meadows there, and really it was hard to find a blade of grass within the hay crop that was coming off them. That's what we're striving for, is that, plus what beauty we would have in the landscape as well. So I'm not suggesting necessarily it's all got to be meadow. It could be, you know, grazed landscapes if you can, so a mixture, because I do worry a bit about the hay crop and what happens to the insects when we suddenly go in and cut everything at the same time. But generally speaking, let's have as much as we can of our wildflowers restored. And there's just showing mycorrhizal fungi associated with the roots. Really, roots do very little other than act as a support for mycorrhizal fungi and a conduit for the nutrients and the water to go through the tree, through the roots into the tree or the plant, and bring down the sugars to feed the mycorrhiza to help them do their work. So I ought to end quite quickly now. Obviously, a few words about HEAL, because yes, this is something we can do. On the whole, I know that we have very little power to change agriculture and very little power to change intensive forestry. These are enormous hurdles, particularly as government money is working against what the public is really saying. The public is saying, we want change. Unfortunately, the funding is not working in that. We've got direct contracts with landowners, which on the whole is working against climate change and working against biodiversity. How we change that, we need the NGOs to really put the pressure on. And I know they've been trying it for decades, but that's the solution, is to really battle with that. But in the meantime, what we can do is support rewilding projects. Many landowners are doing it of their own volition, like the Charlie Burrells and the Knepp. And obviously you can support that by visiting and joining the safaris and camping and things like that. But HEAL offers us a real opportunity to contribute relatively modest sums, but as crowdfunding allows us to help them generate enough money to actually buy land and rewild it. And I'm confident that if we did work with them and provide them with the money, then the biodiversity would bounce back. I know in Somerset, they have acquired land which is right next to other landowners who are doing rewilding of their own volition. So that is going to make a massive landscape. It's right in the heart of the Forest of Selwood, and there's various projects afoot in Selwood to try and make it wilder all over. So watch this space in Somerset, but they're already also talking about the north as well. And I feel as individuals, this is something we can do, in addition, of course, to supporting our wildlife trusts, who on the whole are doing their absolute best to hold on to the biodiversity of those nature reserves so that when we can get the land around them into the right condition, the nature in them can jump out and expand across the landscape. Like for Izzy and Charlie's new book, At Fish Out in May. If you want to know more about how to do it, big and small, then take a look at Izzy's and Charlie's book that's out. And my conclusions. Rewilding land and sea is vital, but if we can do it together, we need a win-win situation, not one or the other. Soils are an absolute priority for sequestration and storage. That's the biggest win that we can get. And I think restoring wildflower-rich areas as wood pastures everywhere is a priority, and they start work immediately. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jill. That was wonderful. I have a whole plethora of questions.
Controversial. I hope there'll be a lot of kickback from that.
Yeah. So let me start. Which first sort of question is really, how big a site do you need to be doing this sort of regenerative work in order for it to realistically make a difference? Do you have a feeling of what sort of quantity of acres you're looking at to actually make that nesting point, which can then go out and populate adjacent areas or bits in the vicinity?
Well, as I showed in the graph, obviously the larger the better. But I know that's not feasible for most of us at all to do that. So what we can do, though, is work together. So we can make a street of gardens wilder. That's a big ask, I know, because you know, I know in my street I've got the very, very tidy, so it's quite a challenge. I do appreciate that, but you know I was saying the larger the better, etc. But I do think we can all make a difference, and in our gardens, and then really the larger the better. Borkner Paradise, which is where Franz Behrer did his study, is only 25 hectares. So I think that even as little as 25 hectares can make an enormous difference, probably smaller than that. I was talking to people the other day and saying that in terms of canopy cover and old growth, London should be a national park. So, you know, I think that we've got to look at things a bit differently. We've got to use what we can. And certainly we mustn't plant up areas that we can, with plantation planting, which, as you heard, I am not a great fan of, when actually we can do more with it with wildflowers, open grown trees, etc. So I do think there's a chance for small, and but obviously the larger the better.
Right, I've got a couple of specific questions, and then I'm going to ask Luke, who has several questions, to unmute himself and do a good thorough going over. So the simpler questions for you to get round first are, one is, why are native deer so unpopular? Native deer.
Sorry,
there's a lot of work really of saying, well, we need to kill them, we need to control them. What is
why are
reality?
Deer, why are they such a problem? Well, this is because we have this concept that we have to have regeneration under the trees in the forestry areas. This is because we have a mindset of foresters rather than of what is really what nature is wanting to do. And when you have a lot of shade, any grazing will have an impact on what is managing to survive in that limited shade. It's a double pressure on that lower area under the canopy. And so it really comes from ancient woodlands and foresters, and it's locked up in our old-fashioned thinking that that's what we want. But this idea that we want trees to regenerate under themselves is old-fashioned ecology generated by Tansley and who was the other great guy that help me out here, the other main anyway, it'll come back to me. They did linear succession. Their idea was linear succession, the idea that a lake fills up with silt, then it covers over with sallows, and then gradually turns into full-scale woodland. What they didn't really realize is that that is a route to more and more shade tolerance, because the only trees that can come up under the canopy of the trees are those trees which are more shade tolerant than the canopy above them. So it drives very, very quickly towards beech and yew and holly, and we can see that all around our countryside. And if you go to the long-term minimum intervention sites in France, etc., and in other parts of Europe, you can see 150 years and it's gone to a monoculture of the most shade tolerant species. Well, we don't want a monoculture, and we don't want the most shade tolerant, because we want diversity in the landscape. But I'm afraid that's what our ecologists are almost prescribing for us, because they don't understand this idea that the regeneration should be coming up outside the wood and not inside. That's where the light is, outside the wood. Mm-hmm. And anyway, so deer are a problem if you have this mindset that you want regeneration in shady conditions. And that's why we are constantly controlling deer. And they've also got a bad press, of course, in Scotland because of stopping regeneration there. And, you know, again, that could be because we're artificially feeding the deer because they're very important for the shooting estates. But really, it's also a fact that, you know, the deer have no, you know, they are widely spreading widely and can nip out the trees. But there's no protection there. I don't know what the sheep have got rid of all the scrub that would have provided the protection for trees to grow in the protection of that thorny scrub. That's been very badly eroded. You can see that happening in the uplands of the Lake District and Wales, where the sheep, this is why I'm so against sheep, is they totally undermine scrub and it becomes weakened and eradicated. And so then you've lost your protective fencing, your protected thorny fencing that allows your regeneration of the trees. So the systems bust, and that's why deer get a bad name.
Thank you. Now I have a question from Ben about ponies, and his question is whether the new forest ponies have got the same sort of early DNA as the Exmoor pony. What makes the Exmoor pony a more historical beast than some of the other native breeds in the UK?
That's a very good question, and I'm afraid I haven't looked into that, but my understanding is that they're not as close DNA to the wild horse as the Exmoor is. And even within the Exmoor, there's been a lot of external breeding. And so the actual real Exmoor pony, there's not very many of them. And there has been great worries in the last few decades that we would lose that DNA, you know, that concentration of DNA that's in pure Exmoors. So all I can say is they look just like the cave paintings of Southern Europe, and that's what experts tell me.
Right, I'm going to, I hope, hand over to Luke, who's got many questions, and if he can't manage to unmute himself, And I know it's impossible for Martin to, there he comes, wonderful. Can you unmute yourself? Will you ask some of your questions of Jill, please?
Hello, Luke. I'm not hearing you, Luke.
I have unmuted you, Luke, so you seem to have disappeared.
Right, well, I'll go along with his questions while he's trying to reappear. So the first question is, what size and age are you classifying old growth trees?
That's a very good question.
And how would you classify an ancient tree?
Right.
Would you find these on boundaries or streets or stream sides? Would they be ancient boundary markers?
Yeah, there's certainly ancient boundary markers. Absolutely. Quite a few at Windsor are on the old deer park boundaries. An ancient tree is basically a tree that's beyond maturity. So a tree grows up through its young stage. At that stage, it's got lots of apical dominance, gets to its full height, which is genetically programmed. And then during maturity, it just fills out that crown. Then as it can't grow any higher, then things start to happen, and the tree then goes beyond that highest point. And at that point, we're starting to talk about it being an ancient tree. So 3 life stages: young, mature, and ancient. In the case of oak and yew and sweet chestnut, that ancient life stage is longer than the young and mature life stages put together. And that, I think, is really incredible. With a beech tree, the ancient phase is usually the same as the, they grow up in about 100 years, a young phase, 100 years of maturity, and then 100 years of coming down from maturity. So that 200 to 300 is the ancient life stage of the beech. So each species of tree goes into its ancient life stage at a different size and possibly years to other species. And obviously birch is very considered relatively short-lived as well. So it'll be up at maturity by 80 years, 20 years, 30 years of maturity, and then really has gone into ancient life stage, and that ancient life stage is, generally speaking, quite short. The thing that can prolong trees' lives is pollarding, and that is an incredible story, a European incredible story. And lots of people in the New World think we're being cruel to trees, but if we could chop off our fingers and live another twice as long, 3 times as long as we live with our fingers, then I think we would have a lot of fingerless people walking around. So let's not, and actually the trees don't lose their fingers, they regrow the fingers. So it's not like, we chop off our fingers and we've lost them. If we could chop them off and they regrew very quickly, then, and could live 2, 3 times our current lifespan, I expect a lot of us would be doing it from a very early age. So that's the ancient life stage. And really, to have old growth, you've got to have a proportion of those old trees, about 15% old growth, and then about 85% would be the mature trees, which are already starting to get into a good condition. They may already be hollowing, they may already have lots of decay features, and they are what we're calling mature veterans. And they also can help give the diversity in the habitat. And together, we would call that old growth. And it's got to be, I remember Francis Rose saying, it's got to be reaching into the past. And because these trees are arcs carrying all those other species through time, When they give up, they've got to be able to pass those species onto another tree in the same condition. So the other tree has to be at least say 200 years old to be for an oak or a beech to be in the right condition to then be a habitat for those species. And if you break that chain, then you're not going to have it's very, very hard for those species to come back into those landscapes, depending on distance, really. But we know there's a nice project that was done in Sweden. It was short term because it was a PhD study, but they trained their insects coming out of the old trees to use the same woody material in a type of nest box. And then they moved the nest boxes further away from the tree. And they found that they would only go about 75 meters to the next tree in that 2-year period. So we know that, they had to have the right tree in the right condition relatively close by. So if you think about that for every species of tree, and that they've got to have the next one in the right condition relatively close by, sort of gives you a bit of a picture about what the landscape of the UK must have been like pre-man having a significant impact on it. It would have been very, very much more open.
Well, that leads nicely on to Luke's next question, which is, how can you recreate some of these ideas on the small scales and spaces in local woods, parks, town spaces, really? You've mentioned wildflowers as important, but what about the open parkland with treed landscape?
So the important thing in the current parklands is that there's not an age gap. So we do need to have the next generation coming on, but they've not got to compete with the old trees. So normally, roughly say 35-meter spacings, each tree, instead of a forestry plantation, which is 22-meter spacings, we're talking about 35-meter spacings between trees. And even then, not every 35-meter spacing, because when those trees have grown up a bit, we need more space for the next tree to be generating. And if I think about an oak lasting for, say, 800 to 1,000 years, you need quite a bit of space for all the life stages of that tree to be in that locality. So don't fill it up too quickly, too soon, really. That's for the biodiversity. But obviously, why did the landed gentry move their stately homes into these astonishingly important parklands and parkland landscapes? These medieval deer parks? Well, it was because of the deer. And those deer, they chose areas which already were favoured by the deer. And those deer were cropping the grass short in places called deer lawns. In those days, they called them LAUNDS, lawns, but they were lawns. And so if you are mowing the grass in front of your house or in the back garden, you are behaving like a giant herbivore. So don't stop, but just make sure that you do have you have as much wildflower in there as possible, because you can have daisies and bugle and all sorts of species, can be quite a clover, all respond to a bit of mowing. Don't mow it quite too hard, but you can keep it short, but vary the height of the lawn significantly. And don't plant trees, have flowering shrubs, because you are then mimicking the wood pasture landscape by having that scrub. And the scrub is incredibly important for pollen and fruits, etc. And that scrub in a woodland can't flower, and so it's not, they're in the shade, they find it really difficult to flower. So we shouldn't be thinking of them as understory, we should be thinking of them as outstory. So a place for hawthorn, blackthorn, crabapples, Gelder rose, spindle, all of these are fantastic plants for biodiversity. They're going to, so even if you've got a small garden, you can put a small shrub in and just get that 3 dimension into your garden, and try and persuade other people to do it as well.
Got a couple of questions about the tiny forest idea.
Oh yes. Oh, who would want to squeeze so many trees together? What do they think's going to happen with them? I mean, they just outcompete each other, and it's a nightmare, because you throw any old species in there, and then the ones that are going to pull through are the most aggressive. I mean, in ecology, we're always talking about the most aggressive plants outcompeting the other ones. So please don't do that. Please don't do that. Or if you do, please think about it very carefully, because the light demanding plants will be very quickly outcompeted by the ones that can outcompete them, because they are shade giving and they grow very quickly. If you go to the forests of France, the foresters are, if they want oak, they are ripping out the beech like no tomorrow to get the oaks to come through, because the oaks will suffer from the beech very badly, and they wouldn't have oaks out there. So if you're prepared to go in and then work very hard on it, but why bother? Just plant one beautiful open grown tree, and that will provide you with tree structure, wood structure. You'll have fabulous below ground structure as well. You'll have 360-degree light. You'll have, and this is the open grown tree, 20 times as many leaves as on a plantation tree. So, you've planted 100 trees in that that's dense forest, but actually one tree can give you far more structure and biodiversity than all of those trees planted together.
That's very clear. Right, I have a question from Roger, and he says, it is his understanding that rewilding involves very large areas of land and allowing nature to look after itself with minimum human intervention. This idea seems to be losing ground, and the word is being applied to any kind of land designated as a nature reserve, however small or large, thus diminishing the concept. Would you like to comment on that, please?
Well, yes, I mean, rewilding has, in principle, as I said earlier, needs the large herbivores in the system. We can mimic those large herbivores. So we can, that's what we're doing on our nature reserves, is mimicking those natural processes by cutting or clearing or coppicing or whatever we're doing. We're trying to mimic those natural processes, usually not very effectively. But rewilding is really having a big enough area so that the habitat structure can move across the landscape and change over time across the landscape, but you've got every habitat there in one area. So the larger it is, the more diversity you can have in that shifting mosaic of habitats. But as I say, I know if Franz Vera was here, he would be saying everybody should be striving to rewild what they've got a little bit more. So even if you've got a little garden, take the next step to rewilding. And when you've got there, take the next step to rewilding, if you can. But it is true that real purists would say rewilding is nothing without the large carnivores, and nothing without all the original herbivores. We cannot bring back some of the extinct herbivores. At least we don't know how to do that yet. It worries me if we ever learn the technology or have the technology to bring them back. I mean, it's true, we probably could clone woolly mammoths if we wanted to. It worries me because we might then turn around and clone Boris Johnson from his bones. And I mean, heaven forbid if we sorry. So, you know, they are extinct, and we are doing our best to get analogues. But the purists would say those cattle, you know, if we're managing our nature reserves with domesticated cattle, that isn't strictly speaking rewilding. If we've got them inside a fence, that's not strictly rewilding. If we haven't got the full diversity, the bison, the every single species in that area, it's not strictly rewilding. But whilst we're getting there, I think we've got to do the best we can. And so cattle, and the best cattle analogues by the rare breeds that we can. And yeah, I'd be all for wolves and bears and lynx, etc. But I'm a very lone voice, and there's a lot of people who are very, very anxious about that, and we can see that from places like the Netherlands, where, you know, the debate is happening now about the wolves coming back into the Netherlands, whereas, you know, if you go to Romania, they live with bears, which is amazing.
I've met one in Romania. It was frightening in the extreme. But yes, right. Next question from Graham, which follows on from this one. Why is land abandonment a problem? Don't the large herbivores come in as the farmer leaves?
No, that's the big problem. The animals stop. The large herbivores aren't there. And that means you get tree regeneration everywhere, and I'm afraid it goes to closed canopy. And once you've got to closed canopy, you're losing biodiversity all the time. So that's why it's such a big problem. I'm afraid trees are lovely, and you know, they can be a solution to our problems, but only if we understand their ecology and we understand what is the best for biodiversity, and not just think trees are the only solution. So it's because that so-called natural regeneration really takes over, and then very rapidly goes to closed canopy, and shade tolerance are the only things that can come up under that closed canopy, and it goes very rapidly to monoculture of the most shade tolerant, and that's not what we're wanting.
And in this part of the world, we've got a pretty good quality deer population. Will they not come in?
Well, yes, but they only do a certain amount. You see, deer are not enough, not by any means enough. The more different types of grazing herbivore you can get into the system, the better. And cattle are the best. And that's the problem. Cattle are very expensive animals, and so they're not, we've bred them to be less able to cope on their own. I mean, Frisians wouldn't last 2 seconds in a wilded system, because we've bred them for soft mouths to only eat perennial ryegrass. You know, they're no good at all for the system. You've got to have the tough ones, which are as close as possible to the, you know, they've still got some instinct in there that's for the wild, really.
Another question from Luke. Apart from Charlie and Izzy, who else would you say are the key people to rewilding that people should read, follow, research, look at their book, podcasts?
Yeah. Well, there's that's a very interesting question. So there's a fabulous guy called Benedict MacDonald, I think, who's written Rebirding, and that's a great book, and is saying the same things as well. There's Wild Kenhill up in Norfolk, and also Holcombe, with Jake Beans as the estate manager there. They're doing fantastic things. I gather from Alistair Driver, Rewilding Britain, that there are quite a number now of provisional rewilding schemes. And of course, Charlie Burrell and his syndicate have got their second site up in Lincolnshire, which I've been to, but I don't know off the top of my head what the progress is there. And obviously you've got Heal as well, who are wanting to do a rewilding scheme in every county. So there's a lot going. There is quite a bit going on, but there's nowhere quite like Knepp, and I don't know anywhere that's succeeding like Knepp is succeeding, which is very interesting. What is the magic ingredient there that has made all the difference? What is it? Is it size? Is it that pulse of shrubbery that happened initially? Because I do have my worries about the shrub regeneration there. There was, in places, there's too much shrub regeneration, which means there's too much tree regeneration. Now you could say, well, that's natural processes. No, I'm not a pulse person myself. I think getting the soils right so that your scrub establishes either as, say, hawthorns to create your open grown tree or your blackthorn to create your grove. That is the process that we want. It's more contained, whereas a pulse, well, it just, I think, generates too many trees too quickly. And once the trees get above browse height, that's it. There's, you know, unless you intervene, they're going to close canopy. And a bit of close. I mean, the groves are great, but not scrub areas that have closed canopy in that way. Also in Knepp, we're not finding very much regeneration in the fields now after that pulse. It is happening along the hedgerows, but it's not really happening in the fields. So why isn't that? And I think it's because the soils have been so trashed and they've got a long way to go before they're going to come back to being good structure. And there's been no, in the middle block, he did put a wildflower mix in with a better seed mix of grasses. Unfortunately, that didn't work very well. And so and most of the southern block has become dominated with a flower called fleabane, and we're waiting for that to go over in a way, because we think that that's it's an unnatural pulse of fleabane. But really no effort was made on the wildflower front, and I think that's a great loss. It's missing, and we only have 3% wildflower grasslands left in the countryside. I think that's a great shame. We've got to really look after those and build from them as much as we possibly can.
Right, next one. Another question from Graham about, given the speckled wood is our only closed canopy butterfly species, why did the idea of England as an ancient closed forest habitat persist for so long?
Tell me about it. I think it was this Clements, that was his name, Clements and Tansley. The early ecologists, what they saw was when a piece of land was fenced off, it got colonized by trees and then it went to woodland, well, without the herbivores. And so their idea was that they hadn't really thought about herbivores at all. They never counted them as part of the natural landscape at all. I mean, I think to be fair to them in those days, it was all domesticated cattle and sheep, etc. Sheep are a nightmare. And as far as I know, there's very little deer then. Something really dramatic happened after our Civil War, because, you know, if I look at the history of Windsor Great Forest, it was enormous in the 1600s. And then the king lost it in the Civil War. And when he came back, Charles II came back, he couldn't get all of it back. So it shrank, and there was this massive land grab or something. Nobody's written about it. I'm astonished at the historians. I don't know. Well, maybe somebody's written about it, and I haven't, followed that up. But there was a massive privatization of the land. I mean, there's been massive privatizations of land down through, since the Norman Conquest, and King John, bless his cotton socks, my hero, was fighting like mad to keep the barons at bay from privatizing forests. He doesn't get a good name for that, does he? All propaganda, you know, against him because the barons wanted their bit of land. So we've been privatizing these wonderful wood pastures. That's not the question, was it? What was the question again, Trish?
Oh, I've got to find it again.
Oh, sorry.
It was why did the idea of England as an ancient closed forest habitat persist for so long?
Yeah, so Clements and Townsley came up with this idea that there's a succession of shrubs and then trees, and then you know, it goes to the biggest trees, really. What they hadn't really realized was that meant going to the most shade tolerant trees, which is what happens. That can only be the solution. So every generation of tree coming up in those woodlands is a more shade tolerant species. Every generation changes the whole species structure of that woodland. That can't be right for biodiversity. It can't be the story, because you get no continuity then. The things that are obligate on oak get lost as you make way for sycamore or ash, and then they make way for beech and yew. So that isn't right. But it's got such a hold. And what happened, I think, in the 1980s was that great people like Francis Rose, the botanist, you know, he was aware of what was going on, and he wrote this wonderful book, Pasture Woodlands, but Oliver Rackham was too strong for him and, you know, got a huge amount of following. And although Oliver was fabulous about ancient trees, he was really pushing hard on the value of ancient woodland. Yeah, I mean, ancient woodland is important. I'm not saying it's not. It's just that we've taken our eye off the ball. And, you know, if I want to go to see wildlife, I'd go to the great national parks of Serengeti, etc. That's where I'm going to go. I'm not going to go to the really, you know, the Congo. I mean, it's supposed to be rich in biodiversity, but they say that the savannas are just as rich in biodiversity and, you know, very, very exciting. And, you know, the dense forest is very difficult to navigate in and things like that. So, you know, I'm for the open landscape rather than the closed canopy.
Right, we're still continuing. 2 questions about specific species. One is about the role of ivy as part of the forest system. And the second is, what do you think the impact on biodiversity is going to be with ash dieback?
Oh, 2 good questions. So first of all, did you know that ivy and holly were the protected species in the Norman forest? They were protected plants. They were the vet that were protected. And the reason they were protected was because of they were winter fodder for the deer. So very, very important plants. Both are incredibly important medicinally for large herbivores. You only need to go and see the browsing of the holly by the conies in the New Forest to understand how important they are. Ivy is a wonderful plant, very, very good for biodiversity, but it is given an advantage by the high nitrates in the atmosphere, which are depositing out and giving it a competitive advantage. And they do get up into trees. It does get up into trees. And if the tree is important, then the tree must come first, because the weight of the ivy and the sail in the winter can be a real burden for the trees. And the density of the foliage stops the regeneration of the epiformic growth within the trees, which is what they need to be able to keep alive. So, or, you know, it's part of their life cycle. So ivy is wonderful, but if the tree is important, i.e. is a veteran tree or is going over into its ancient life stage, then the tree must come first, because there's plenty of ivy about. It's not a rare plant, but it's really important. Second question was about ash dieback. Trees outside woods do relatively well in the face of ash dieback. And if they've been pollarded, actually, there seems to be some evidence that pollards are much more resilient to ash dieback. And I was listening to a forester just the other day who was saying where you have lots of death of ash in woodlands, he thinks it's because they have not been managed properly, they haven't been thinned properly, and there's no air circulation. So again, it's all about opening up these woods, allowing a lot more light and air to circulate, and ideally doing that really quite quickly. But I mean, one of the problems is that we've promoted ash as a woodland tree because of squirrels, and now we've got the problem that ash is suffering because of ash dieback in woodlands. But I think outside woods, it's well over the worst, and what we see now is what we've got, which is trees that majority of trees are looking very, very good. Some are looking a little bit ropey, very little otherwise death. It's either gone, it's been cleared away, or the trees haven't been affected. So I think we will have the potential for lots of ash regeneration from those trees that are outside woods, and we should be preventing the felling of any ash tree that we possibly can that seems to have come through the epidemic, so that they can reseed and provide resilient ash trees for the future.
I have a question from Roger. He said, your early map marked Ennerdale, and are you able to say anything more about that?
Ennerdale, wild Ennerdale.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, do I have to?
No, you are in total control of this. Nobody has got stranglehold round your neck.
I went to wild Ennerdale a few years ago. I was very disappointed. It's got such a lovely, it's a bit like, I can say, the Lost Gardens of Heligan. I want them to be lost, thank you, not recovered. And wild Ennerdale has got a magical, magical sound to it. You go there and, well, what's so different? Tell me about it. Lots of Sitka spruce regenerating, bit of clearance of some of the Sitka plantations, not controlling Sitka spruce regeneration particularly, not many large herbivores, there's some, but not much. Sheep still coming in from over the hill. It's a big area. So of course, big areas with low populations, and it's not such a touristy area. Of course, it will have just that edge in the sense of its low disturbance, but I couldn't really see what all the excitement was about myself. But it's a great aspiration, and I wouldn't want to be, I'm being very, very negative, but I'd like to see a little bit more dynamism, the right dynamism in the system. But sorry, that's my experience.
Okay, another question from Graham, back to the abandonment topic. If we release rare breed cattle and ponies into large areas of abandonment in Europe, would that work?
Yes, definitely. It would be fantastic. And that's actually what is happening with Rewilding Europe. This they are targeting places like the Coa Valley in Portugal. They are looking, and if you listen to, that's a very good point. Somebody asked about who's doing things. There is Ben Goldsmith, who is doing podcasts, and he's doing podcasts from all over Europe. I listened to the Spanish one and I was really excited about it because the Spanish have got it and they know what they need to do and they will try and do it. So that's really great. It's a great shame because the southwest corner of Spain, you know, it's just glass horticulture, and that's, you know, really very sad for Spain. But in the north and in Extremadura, there's still very, very big areas of beautiful, beautiful landscape, which is very, very rich in wildlife. So Spain is my great hope because it's a fantastic country and it's really much more sustainable for its old trees than anywhere else in Europe that I've experienced. And I think you could do that. So what they're doing with their Taurus cattle and their bison is releasing them. There's a new film coming out called Taurus, and they've released them into the big areas of karst in Croatia. They're releasing them, as I say, in Spain and Portugal. So they are doing that. What the guy who's making the film or is behind the Taurus program was saying is they may need to now really start upping the generation of these large herbivores to meet the demand, because there could be a huge, it feels like there's a huge demand coming on. That will be the pinch point if we can get enough animals out there. Horses, I think, would be really great. And I don't know why we don't deal with deer in these situations either.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to give you one last rather big question and then let you go and have a large cup of tea. It's got two parts really. People have been saying